Surprise you.
Of world history.
The stories in the Bible are the most powerful narratives.
Years of history, and it really is the first history book until the time of the Greeks. Herodotus was supposed to be the first historian, but in fact I think Moses was.
He remains, without any competition, the greatest legislator of our time. And I thought the Ten Commandments that he brought down from Sinai
But against the idea that the biblical account is true, are raised in protest. These voices say that the biblical narrative is
that we can call the Exodus archaeologically or historically.
Right now, debating some of the most important questions with Rabbi David Wolpe, who leads one of America's largest Jewish congregations.
In 2000 I can't tell you. I don't know. I don't know. And although it may.
Question that troubled a filmmaker from Minneapolis named Timothy Mahoney. As he probed more deeply, little did Mahoney realize how far his journey would take him.
I was raised as a Christian, and I remember hearing amazing stories from the Bible as a child, and I believe them. Sons of Jacob, who came from a foreign land to Egypt. They were enslaved by the Pharaoh, then miraculously delivered out of Egypt, and journeyed across the desert to conquer the promised land. But as I grew older, I was challenged to lose those beliefs. Now,
The Exodus is believed by most scholars to have occurred in the reign of Ramesses II. Ramesses was Egypt's greatest builder king. Were these mighty monuments built on the sweat and toil of Hebrew slaves?
if experts say there's no evidence during the time of Ramesses, why do they think he's the Pharaoh of the Exodus? I'm no historian, so I had to find a way to visualize how the history of marking every 1,000 years.
Over the course of 2,000 of art and literature. Finally, the New Kingdom, with its vast empires that
important city, which we know Ramses II built. It's being excavated even as we speak and continues to be studied. Than 200 years. So the question is, if this building project that the Israelites are involved in is Ramses II's Delta residence,
can be confusing to work with because they move in the opposite direction to modern AD dates. The farther back you go in time, the bigger the BC number. So the Ramesses or at about 1250 BC. I wanted an Egyptian perspective, so I went to see Mansour Barayak, Director General of Antiquities for Luxor, one of Egypt's most important archaeological Israelites, or the Exodus in Egypt.
Nobody knows what the sand of Egypt can tell of secrets. Maybe in the excavation we'll find some evidences. But so far, there is no documented evidence about the Exodus. But we know the Exodus from the Holy Books.
But then I heard of something that seemed astonishing.
Egyptologists. Professor Manfred Bitak and his Austrian team have been digging in Egypt's delta for over 30 years at the site of Avaris.
These exciting new finds.
So we uncovered the remains of a huge town of 250 hectares with a population of approximately 25,000 to 30,000 individuals. These were people who originated from
and multiplied greatly. This was just what I was looking for. So I asked him, could these foreigners be the Israelites when they match the Bible story so well?
According to my opinion, the settlement of the Proto-Israelites in Canaan only happened from
early to be connected to the events of the Exodus. This is profound. Christians, it means Jesus Christ and the writers of the New Testament got it wrong. Because I've been believing in a lie all this time. And what about my kids and grandkids? What should they
Mahoney arranged to meet with one of America's leading Egyptologists, Professor Kent Weeks. He rediscovered KV5, the events.
Ramses II is the pharaoh of the Exodus. How can we prove that? Chronology doesn't really help. The chronology of Egypt more confusing. We don't know precisely when the Exodus happened. Some people say it was Ramses II. It makes nice theater because he was a great, powerful ruler. Everybody knows his name. He built fantastic monuments. Everything really is a piece. Ramses II is the pharaoh of the Exodus, but other Egyptologists disagree. Almost any pharaoh could be the pharaoh of the Exodus if we can prove there even was an Exodus.
But if Ramesses wasn't the pharaoh of the Exodus, then who was? Looking for the Exodus in a different
To open your mind to all the opinion, read it by yourself. Don't let anybody affect in what you believe. But
The oldest accounts of the Exodus were written down in Hebrew, in the first 5 books of the Bible, known as the Torah.
I asked Rabbi Manis Friedman, a member of Judaism's Orthodox branch. I wanted to know what the story was actually claiming.
The story of the Exodus through the length and breadth of this land, for I am giving it to you. On that day, the Lord made a covenant, a formal promise to Abraham. He said, "To your descendants, I give this land."
As my team and I looked more closely at this account, we could see that these biblical events formed a sequence. Starting with the arrival of Abraham's descendants in Egypt, their tremendous multiplication, Egypt, and finally in Canaan, their conquest of the Promised Land. If the Exodus really happened, by looking for patterns of evidence, and a truly scientific approach looks for those patterns no matter where they exist.
The book of Genesis tells us that the first descendant of Abraham to arrive in Egypt was his great-grandson, Joseph, the son of Jacob. Joseph's brothers had sold him as a slave to a caravan of traders who brought him down to Egypt.
My objective was to see if any specific evidence had been uncovered of the Semitic family group arriving in Egypt, as told in the Bible. So far, Arthur had answers to the very doubts that Bitek had raised in me.
Yet, he clearly sees archaeological evidence of the biblical Joseph, Jacob, and the early Hebrews in the Nile Delta region of Egypt. Roll believes that many Egyptologists have missed evidence for the Exodus because they have been looking for it in the wrong time period. While most scholars think
Tell me, who is Manfred Bitek?
Manfred Bitek is probably one of the greatest archaeologists alive today, and he's dug at one of the most important sites in the Eastern Delta, a city called Avaris, which is in the land of Goshen, which the Bible calls it, and I believe this is the place where Joseph and his brethren lived.
Well, I went to see Manfred Bitek.
Right.
And that's not what he said. He said there's no evidence of this at the time of Ramesses.
Exactly right. Most scholars will say if you look at the city of Ramesses, there are no Asiatics there. There are no Western Asiatics living at that particular
thing.
I'm saying that this particular mention of the city of Ramses, the building of Ramses, is what we call an anachronism. It's something that's been added into the text later by an editor.
Uses the word Ramesses hundreds of years before Pharaoh Ramesses or his city existed to describe the land where Joseph
Now this Avaris is the city which lies under the biblical Ramesses. Ramesses of the New Kingdom, Avaris of the Middle Kingdom, the 13th dynasty. It lies underneath the city that's mentioned in the Bible. So when Betak digs up a huge population of Semitic-speaking people, type of house is found in North Syria, the area where Abraham came from. It's exactly they all went back to get their brides from there. So the culture that turns up in Egypt at the end of the 12th dynasty seems to have come from It's flattened, and on top of it, an Egyptian palace is constructed, Egyptian architecture this time. Chapels on top of them.
You have 12
We
graves.
have 12 graves.
And why would that be significant?
Well, think about it. How many sons did Jacob have?
Yeah, 12.
How many tribes were there?
12 tribes.
Exactly. It was a pyramid tomb. This in itself is extraordinary. Even so, he was honored with a king's burial. But this man had red hair. He had pale yellow skin, which is how Egyptians depict northerners. He had a throw stick across his shoulder, a unique symbol. As a gift which shows that he was the favorite of the father.
the same as Joseph did. It's just an incredible thing to find this at this time period.
The Exodus was a unique opportunity to meet with Israel's President Shimon Peres and hear his perspective about the character of Joseph and his rise from slavery to governing Pharaoh's court.
If you look at the way the story is written, God chose him for a mission.
Empire in the vicinity. He conquered the heart of everybody he saw, men and women.
Was able to save Egypt by warning of a coming calamity. 7 years of plenty would be followed
cows, and then 7 lean cows come out and devour the fat cows. It's an extraordinary story, but the clue here is that these cows are coming out of the Nile. It's the Nile itself which is the cause of both the plenty and the famine.
If David's interpretation is right, then the regulation of the Nile may have been
Goes back thousands of years as far as we can tell.
Why do you think that canal has that name?
Because I think he made it. I think it was under his instructions as Vizier of Egypt that canal was cut, and it was cut to divert half the water from the Nile.
And then the famine comes to the entire region, and only Egypt has bread. So everyone comes to Joseph for what So Pharaoh, by the end of the 7 years, owns everything.
If there ever was a time in this era when a dramatic shift of wealth and power occurred between the people of Egypt and the Pharaoh, he went to Pennsylvania to see an
Gnomes had tremendous wealth and tremendous power. We get to a point in Egyptian history concentrated with the Pharaoh. What on earth happened here? If you read the Egyptian history books, there is no explanation for it. They don't know what happened, how it happened. I mean, this was a tremendous social, economic change.
Well, what do you think happened?
Well, we have the answer in the Bible, and it's Joseph's famine policy, and he brings the wealth into Pharaoh, and it fits exactly with Egyptian history.
David believes these events occurred during the reigns of two important Middle Kingdom pharaohs.
This key time is during the co-regency between Senusret III and his son Amenemhat III. I believe this is the time of the famine, and that Amenemhat was Joseph's pharaoh. Amenemhat is depicted with worry. The waterway of Joseph.
The amount of archaeological evidence matching the first step of arrival in the biblical the Syrian-styled house that appeared in the Delta along with a palace fit for royalty, whose occupant was a high Semitic official from the Canaan area who wore a multicolored coat. The waterway of Joseph, contemporary with the rise of Avaris. Yet these events converged at a time when the statues of the pharaohs were depicted in a unique, careworn way, the telltale signs of a kingdom in distress.
They're much too early to be Israelites. I'm basically saying, well, why not call a spade a spade? To me that this man with the multicolored coat is Joseph is found in the story of Exodus. When Joseph is on his deathbed, he tells his brethren that when they leave, they must take his body with them to the promised land. What matches the story even more incredibly is that pyramid tomb was empty when the archaeologists found it. There was nothing in it at all apart from a few fragments of this smashed statue. There were no bones, there were no mummy beads, no coffin wood, nothing. It was cleaned out. The body was taken out and all the grave goods were taken out. I think this is the tomb of Joseph, the pyramid tomb of Joseph, honored by Pharaoh with a colossal statue, that when Moses to the tomb and take it to Shechem and bury him in the promised land.
Photographed in the 1800s is where many believe Joseph's bones were finally laid. The city is known today as Nablus on the West Bank, where this tomb has been at the center of much political.
At this stage, I didn't care. I was determined to stick with the guidelines of the investigation, looking for a pattern of evidence, wherever it might exist.
Exceedingly great multiplication.
So Joseph dies, and his brothers, and the entire generation. The Israelites are multiplying, and they're fruitful exceedingly until they fill
a city of foreigners in the Egyptian Delta. and it's been allowed by the Egyptian state. At this stage, there's no slaves involved here. We're talking about Semitic peoples coming in, living here, bringing
from a Canaanite in Egypt, culturally speaking anyway.
Archaeology shows massive numbers of Semites living in ancient Egypt is in this earlier period around the Middle Kingdom. This is strikingly different from the New Kingdom and the time of Ramesses, when there is no evidence of this. Cecil B. DeMille portrayed this slavery in two of his famous films.
It was intriguing to see this type of construction in different parts of Egypt. Were any of these bricks molded by the hands of Israelite slaves?
inhumane group of men.
The Bible then tells us that the more the Hebrews were oppressed, the more they multiplied, and the more they spread throughout the land of Egypt. It was during a basket and floats it among the reeds of the river Nile. She finds him, adopts him, and names him Moses, which means
side of the population. So could this massive increase in infant burials at Avaris be evidence for the killing of the male Israelite children? It could have meant the murder of thousands of innocent boys.
The Exodus story has given hope to people around the world in their quest for liberation. Inspired by the freeing of the slaves, on a myth?
Who would invent a story about our ancestors were slaves? That just, I can see people saying, our ancestors were princes, our ancestors were great merchants, our ancestors were,
Pages of the Bible.
There's one particular document which is quite amazing. It's called the Brooklyn Papyrus. And this actually is a list of domestic servants from one estate. Were in Egypt as slaves. It's when you get a text, suddenly you've got history. Archaeology, you have to interpret. When you have a text, this is something very different. also Israelite names, these can't be the Israelites because it's the wrong time period. The Israelites are much later in history. So these people we're seeing here in this Brooklyn papyrus cannot be the Israelites.
So that's why they disregard it.
So they put it to one side and say it's another coincidence.
So there appears to be strong evidence matching the multiplication and slavery steps of the biblical sequence. Indication of a rapid expansion of
Kingdom are not a coincidence, and the Exodus actually did happen much earlier than the reign of Ramesses. To see if that's the case, I would need to look more closely at the details of the biblical story concerning the next step of the sequence, the judgment of Egypt and the Israelites' deliverance from bondage.
Moses first encountered God.
Moses sees a bush. Don't come any closer. Remove your shoes.
He was responsible for cosmic order. He was responsible for the proper flow of the Nile, the rising of the sun, the fertility of the fields, and so on. And now we have the God of Israel, the God of creation of the Bible, who's saying, no, wait a minute, that's not what you do. I'm the one who controls all these.
Upon civilizations in the last 3,000 years.
Moses was the greatest revolutionary of all time. Remember that in antiquity there were grand empires that were based
The text then says that God sent the Lord told the Israelites that each household was to slaughter a lamb and mark the doorposts with the blood of the lamb. And on that horrible night, death passed over. Every records confirm that the Passover has been observed for thousands of years. Many believe it is difficult to explain the origin of Passover if there were no real event on which it was based.
Conditions of history, God the Lord had in some way made possible through Moses our liberation.
But what about those who think the Exodus never happened? Noted Israeli archaeologist Israel Finkelstein the Bible unearthed. He has argued that the Exodus did not happen in the manner described in the Bible.
I think that I make a distinction in my private life, in my life as a scholar, in my life as part of a family. I make a very clear distinction between scholarship and tradition. When I sit to the Passover meal and we read the Haggadah with the family, that evening it's all history from A to Z. Perfect history. Because history is not only about the time of Moses, let's say, okay? History is also about all those many generations of my forefathers who were sitting to the same table, in Passover at the same time and reciting the Haggadah. This is also history. And
of what the Old Testament says about the character of God and his purposes in calling Israel are intertwined with this story.
Decade of searching. This is what it comes down to. Or is it simply the traditions of a If the judgment happened as described in the Bible, Egyptian society would have collapsed. Defeat 40 years after the Exodus.
Believe it because we believe in the Bible. There are no Egyptian sources that describe it. There are no other documents, there are no archaeological sources that could prove this took place as a mass exodus.
Raven's position, again, is that of most Egyptologists today. This Egyptian document bear a remarkable resemblance to the plagues of the Bible, only from an Egyptian point of view. Written by a scribe named Ipuwer, the papyrus known as the Admonitions of an Egyptian Sage poetically describes a series of calamities and the chaos that followed.
Ipuwer. We don't know who he was, but he was obviously somebody in the position to address His Majesty, the King. There's only one copy of this specific text, and that is here in the Leiden Museum. It's a very, very vivid report, or would-be report, of what happens to Egypt when the central power falls away.
Many believe a collapse of Egypt's power is exactly what would have happened due to the plagues of Exodus. And as I compared the book of Exodus to
died and the Nile reeked, so that the Egyptians could not drink water from the Nile.
The river is blood. If you drink of it, you lose your humanity and thirst for water.
Fire ran down from heaven, and the Lord sent hail.
Gone is the barley of abundance. Food supplies are running short. The nobles hunger and suffer. Behold, plague sweeps the land. Blood is everywhere. With and mingled with lamentations.
All the time we have to convince ourselves that this person can't have seen all this. He imagined. That's a quite different story. Whether this happened. And again, yes, God was angry and punished the Egyptians, but
that the papyrus, the admonitions of Ipuwer, referred to a real national calamity. Agreeing with other scholars, she stated the following.
The description of chaos in the admonitions is inherently contradictory, hence historically impossible. On the one hand, the land is said to suffer from total want. On the other hand, the poor are described as becoming rich, of wearing fine clothes, and generally of disposing of all that once belonged to their masters.
However, when you read the biblical account, it becomes clear how this appears.
For clothing.
People are stripped of clothes. This slave takes what he finds: gold, lapis lazuli.
It became obvious to me and my team that if people look the university professors who've been convincing the world to dismiss the Bible have been doing so based mainly on this one issue, chronology, the dates assumed for the Exodus, and the lack of evidence at the time of Ramesses II. But if it happened long before his time, then it means they're all wrong.
all the different conquered nations, the nations that are at peace. But right at the bottom, we have three crucial lines. Israel are these two figures here, these two seated figures of a woman and a man, and three strokes underneath. These three strokes mean plural. Peret eth. Israel is laid waste, his seed is no more.
Well, does it mean they were literally no more?
No. During periods of Moses and Joshua, they seem to be a political entity.
This monument doesn't fit the idea of Ramesses being the pharaoh of the Exodus because it was written shortly after his death. And it recognizes Israel already existing in Canaan as one of the significant powers of the day. And that shouldn't be.
It's called the Berlin Pedestal. It's in the State Museum in Berlin, Germany. And this is something that's just now being studied and discussed by scholars.
On the base of this Egyptian statue, they showed Mahoney name rings, each representing an enemy defeated by Pharaoh in the region of Canaan.
So would these have been captured people?
Realize that pharaohs all the time exaggerate, to say the very least.
So is he bragging?
He's bragging.
Okay.
He's bragging. He's saying, I've conquered these people, I control these people. This is the one that's caused all of the excitement because you have Israel. And this dates to around 1360. This makes the late date of the Exodus an impossibility. This is 100 years earlier.
This is
Egypt's enemy a century before the Ramesses Exodus date. So obviously, Ramesses could not have been the pharaoh. Of power that would match the biblical judgment of Egypt.
I don't see any evidence that during the reign of Ramses II there was a significant decline in the strength of the army, in the economic well-being of the country. I don't see anything in the succeeding reign of
of years before Pharaoh Ramesses ruled. Yet it clearly says it was 480 years from the
Solomon began his reign in 970 BC. So 400
can be shifted 200 years earlier. But my challenge isn't over, because this new biblical date, around 1450 BC, still leaves the events separated from the Egyptian pattern by 200 years. I was determined to find an answer for this, and to do so, I would continue to explore the pattern that seemed to exist in the earlier period.
Is there any indication in the Middle Kingdom of the next step of the Bible sequence, a massive and sudden exodus following the death of the firstborn? Roll told Mahoney about something amazing that was found at Avaris.
We find an extraordinary thing happens. The archaeologists have been digging this area, suddenly find lots of pits in the ground. And in these pits are bodies, and they've been tossed into these pits. They're not buried formally. They have no grave goods or anything like that. These bodies are tossed on top of each other. They're lying strewn. You have hands and legs crossing over. What is happening here? What is going on? BTAC thinks it's actually some sort of plague that's happened. A dramatic event where suddenly they have to bury people very quickly because of contamination of the living population. Sudden, all these Semitic peoples who were living there suddenly get up, they pack their bags and they leave, and the whole mound
"120 miles to the excavators found a walled and guarded settlement, which supported a large Semitic population. They also found documentation of slavery. Supposedly David, the town's abandonment, was sudden and unpremeditated. Their goods were found in the streets and houses of Cahoon, exactly where they were left, before being buried by the
is the collapse of Egyptian civilization when these foreigners invade, these Hyksos rulers come in and destroy the land, and the Egyptian native happens once in 1,000 years of Egyptian history. If we can link this to a very famous tradition told to us by an Egyptian priest called Manetho, he wrote a history of Egypt in the 3rd century BC, and what we end up with is a story like this. In the reign of a king called Dudimose, one of the last kings of the 13th dynasty, in his reign, God smote the Egyptians. And God here is singular. You would expect to see, and the gods smote the Egyptians, but you don't. You see God smote the Egyptians. And then, because of the smiting, whatever the smiting is, foreigners, people of obscure
The earlier pattern of evidence for the Judgment and Exodus steps includes a Middle Kingdom papyrus that describes events remarkably similar to the biblical plagues, grave pits Egyptian source outside the Bible stating that a powerful God acted in Egypt's history, delivering a deadly blow which led to an invasion by foreigners. And all this coinciding with the only collapse of Egyptian society in 1,000 years.
You look for a collapse in Egyptian civilization, and that's where you'll find Moses and the Exodus.
But what about the final step of that sequence?
The land of Canaan was very different from Egypt. It was a land ruled by many independent city-states with names like Hatzor, Jericho, Hebron, and Arad. The history of these cities has been divided into two major time periods. It sees no evidence for a biblical conquest of the Promised Land.
As an archaeologist, I hate to disappoint people, but we have no evidence for a single mass migration of people from one country over a period of 40 years wandering and coming into another country. There is destruction. Amazing destructions. None of them actually fit one another. They all happened within 100 years.
Many places which are mentioned in the Joshua, in the conquest story, specifically mentioned, as major places in Canaan, were excavated. And I'm speaking about major excavations.
If it really happened in the late Bronze Age. But again, what if it happened in the earlier Middle Bronze Age? It seemed only logical to begin by looking at the key site of Jericho, the first city the Israelites are said to have destroyed. And we know exactly where that was.
Major archaeological excavations. This was followed by a British team headed by John Garstang in the 1930s. At the time of their digs, both Sellon and Garstang believed they had uncovered a layer of destruction that matched the biblical story. However, things took a dramatic turn when Kathleen Kenyon dug at Jericho in the 1950s.
In the 13th century, they'd have found almost nobody there, no walls to collapse. It just wouldn't have fitted the biblical narrative.
When Jericho was destroyed, where the walls fell down or it was burned?
I don't think so. I don't think that we have evidence, this kind of evidence in the case of Jericho. And I don't think that we can really look for this evidence. We are very much past this phase of archaeological research.
But David Rohl sees things differently.
If people are telling us that there was no Jericho at the time that Joshua conquered the
Rachav hid the spies and aided their escape to the mountains.
What evidence do you see matching the conquest of Jericho?
That the tell that the city's built on was surrounded by a great earthen rampart.
It was protected by a brilliant defensive system. At its base was a stone retaining wall more than 15 feet high, with a defensive extension wall of mud bricks rising higher still.
With the Ark of the Covenant and the sounding of rams, long blast on their horns.
Collapsed, and they actually fell down to the base of the stone retaining wall. Kenyon describes it very clearly and in detail in her excavation report, and then we're told they set the city on fire. And that's exactly what we find. Jericho was massively destroyed by fire. The walls of the buildings had fallen as well. And she says that the walls fell before the fire. Then the city being set on fire by the Israelites.
Excavations at the site uncovered clear evidence
were supposed to be there. She made no connection between the destruction and the biblical account. But once again, this state fits the earlier pattern I've been seeing.
Within the city, a very unique discovery was made. Both Garstang and Kenyon found in the houses that they excavated many jars full of grain.
Biblical account point to an event that happened sometime in the spring. Harvest is gathered in, the grain harvest.
When the Israelites crossed the Jordan,
Fighting the spies, they promised her that she and her family would be protected when they attacked the city. And they kept their promise. She had marked her home with a scarlet cord, which she hung out the window.
Came across the actual archaeological report that the German excavator of Jericho, Ernst Sellen, and I could see that his work was impressive, but now seemed to have been forgotten. Here were detailed plans and photographs, including one part of the site, which echoed
did not fall in this area. Rahab and her family, because God brought the wall down everywhere else except where her house was, and we have archaeological evidence to back that up. I cannot plant it in the ground. I have analyzed it and compared it to the Bible, and I say, wow, it matches exactly. That's science. Look at your evidence and come to a conclusion based on the evidence.
With high fortification walls that fell down. Evidence that the city was intentionally burned after the collapse. Storage jars filled with charred grain, evidence of a short siege in springtime. Biblical account, Joshua spoke a curse against anyone who would rebuild the city of Jericho. And the archaeology shows that after the destruction, the city of Jericho was indeed abandoned for centuries. But of course, using the conventional dates for Egypt and Canaan. However, David Roll and John Bimson have a different idea. They propose that Kenyon came to a wrong destruction date at Jericho because the dates is But there's more to the conquest than just Jericho. Spies had reported that Canaan was a beautiful land, flowing with milk that had walls reaching up to heaven. One by one, they would fall to Joshua.
We found tablets in the Middle Bronze Age palace belonging to a king called Jabin, and that's the name of the king that Joshua actually stuck his sword into in the story.
This is the cuneiform tablet containing the name of Jabin, found in remains of the palace in ancient Hatzor.
So you have a connection between the Bible story and these tablets.
We have a name that's identical. We have a tablet coming out
But when looking for the conquest in the ruins. This has been a key factor in the current skepticism over the biblical
and amazingly, they all suffered major destructions in the same short period, just as described in the Bible.
When you put those cities side by side, the biblical account and the archaeology match extremely well. I think we have enough
the beginning of the sojourn in Egypt, the slavery, Moses and the Exodus, the conquest of the Promised Land is all there in one nice, neat line, but it's way too early.
Roll Bimson and others. Of Egypt's history be shifted forward on the timeline by centuries.
And all of a sudden, these things
I'm not into this business at all, and I think that we know enough to say that we may be wrong 10 years here and 10 years there, but there's no way, you know, to change, to shift centuries. I mean, forget it. I think that we are on solid ground, so there's no
What was I supposed to do now? Hoffmeyer and Finkelstein ignore it. The fact is, but the biblical pattern was so strong that I just couldn't let it go.
Mahoney's researchers uncovered a lead that led him to Oxford University. On St. John Street is the Griffith Institute, one of the greatest storehouses of Egyptological documents in the world. He was here to review the writings of the late Sir Alan Gardner, perhaps the greatest specialist in reading hieroglyphs in the 20th century. And he
following a path that he had helped to clear. After a lifetime of searching, Gardner wrote something that directly impacted the question I was dealing with. If all we have are rags and tatters, how sure can we be about the dates? Alan Gardner said that what we have is rags and tatters. Is that centuries. But the reality is, a shift wouldn't just affect Egypt, because the archaeological dates for Canaan and the surrounding region are all dependent on Egypt's history.
When all is said and done, it's the Egyptian chronology that underpins everything else that's being done throughout the rest of the known world. It's a big responsibility, and it's one of the reasons that people look at it so closely, because in terms of reconstructing,
because they're connected.
But a lot of people don't want to do that.
No, because Egyptian chronology has been assumed to be fixed now for a very long period of time. So the whole idea of taking it apart and starting again is anathema to most Egyptologists.
in order to see evidence for the Exodus. James Hoffmeyer believes textual clues in the Bible point to the Exodus happening at the 1250 BC Ramesses date. Bryant Wood Israel appearing as a nation in Canaan. So an exodus of some kind must have taken place.
But the only place that I saw a pattern matching all the steps was in the Middle Kingdom, not the New Kingdom. And if that's not a coincidence,
The dates of ancient history is intensifying, while the conclusions of those who support major adjustments differ in their details. They're all of the same mind that these things are worth lesser-known dark periods of Egypt's past. They think scholars have miscalculated their lengths, causing distortions in the dates for everything before them.
third dark period. Yet the archaeology of these cultures does not
way. And that's the exciting bit, because that's when we suddenly start to find evidence for the biblical story.
It's startling to think how significant this could be, because chronology evidence matching the conquest of the Promised Land. I know there's a lot of disagreement over the dating, but what strikes me is that if you put all the dates to the side for a moment, what emerges from the archaeology is this pattern that matches the Bible every step of the way and doesn't established conventions will not allow these connections to be made. I'm not an Egyptologist, I'm a filmmaker. And I'm not endorsing any one dating theory out there. I'm just searching for the truth. Because isn't that what the pursuit of both science and faith should be? A search for truth.
I had to ask that same question of myself. Was I willing to follow this story to where it really led? And we just felt that, you know what, we just had to let people know what the truth was.
A mighty sea and travel on to Mount Sinai.